Okay, hello chaps. Welcome to another video on public sector finance and fiscal policy. This video is actually from theme 4. We're now on to theme 4, but to start with, the first few topics in theme 4 recap and build upon a lot of the stuff we've looked at already in theme 2. So as I said, public sector finance and fiscal policy, let's crack on. So, first to understand, we need to know what government borrowing is. What is meant by government borrowing? Public sector borrowing, so by public sector we mean the government, is the amount the government must borrow each year to finance their spending. It is equal to the size of the deficit. So government spending, G, is mostly funded by tax revenue and other forms of government revenue. However, that difference, the deficit, has to be made up somehow, and the way the government pays that is it borrows the money. The national debt then is the public sector debt accumulated over time by the government. So it's all the borrowing over the years. If you add up the amount borrowed over every years, that's the amount of national debt the public sector has. So let's have a look at some data quickly. So in the UK, we can see on the left, borrowing in the UK. The UK consistently borrows. This public sector net borrowing, almost all years since the 90s, we've had significant budget deficits. In 2009, this is when we perhaps peak after the financial crisis. We were steadily going down. This perhaps is austerity coming into play, trying to cut the deficit, as you remember. At the start of 2018, 2019, we were very low in our budget deficit. However, unfortunately, the data isn't quite up to date with the current coronavirus concerns. So clearly, this is going to spike in the next year and perhaps in a few years coming up after that too. National debt. Then national debt has steadily increased over this, and this is because we have been borrowing. Every year this is positive. Every year we have an amount borrowed, the national debt will increase. However, what's also important to note, and we'll talk about this later, is this yellow line shows the national debt as a percentage of GDP, and generally it's considered that our debt isn't problematic if our national debt as a proportion of GDP is going down, because that means we're getting into a position where we are better able to pay off our national debt. And we'll talk about that later on in this video. So we have a couple of important distinctions to make. The first is we need to understand what a cyclical budget deficit is. Hopefully this is a bit of a recap for most of you, but a cyclical budget deficit is where government borrows as a result of fluctuations in tax revenue and government spending due to the economic cycle. For example, in a recession, tax revenues will be very low and spending on unemployment benefits will increase. And in a boom, for example, the opposite is true. In a boom, when incomes are higher and profits are higher, the government will get more tax revenue and they'll need to spend less on benefits and other welfare payments. So in theory, our government spending will go down in a boom. These occur automatically with no changes to fiscal policy, and they lead into what is called our automatic stabilisers, because there's no need for the government to try and intervene in the policy, change the policy. So automatic stabiliser then a mechanism that reduces the impact of changes in the economy on national income, thus reducing fluctuations around the trend rate that occur automatically. So if we have, I'm just going to draw it in small, here's our trend rate, here is our actual level of GDP on the Y, time on the X. Automatic stabilisers act to push our actual towards our trend rate. So we're stabilising the fluctuations we see in the business cycle. A structural budget deficit then is slightly more concerning. A structural budget deficit is an estimate of how large the fiscal deficit would be if the economy was operating at normal, the sustainable level of employment and activity. It is associated with discretionary fiscal policy. So what that means, discretionary fiscal policy, deliberate fiscal policy that is set by the government of the time. The manipulation of government expenditure and taxes to influence the economy. So this is saying perhaps some governments might want to try and pursue rapid economic growth. They might try and spend a lot increase G a lot, and perhaps not want to increase taxes because that will stifle the other components. So it might like cut taxes. And if they're doing this, it's going to be likely lead to a deficit that isn't automatic. This deficit here has been caused by the government trying to pursue greater economic growth in this case. That brings us to perhaps our golden rule, which is a guideline for the operation of fiscal policy over the economic cycle. And this rule states that the government will borrow only to invest in an economy and not to fund current spending. So it's not to fund an employment benefit, for example, but the borrowing the government makes is used to invest into the economy and increase our output into the future. This golden rule was brought in by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the UK government in the late 90s, but it was removed in the aftermath of the fiscal crisis because clearly lots more borrowing needed to take place in order to stimulate the economy and get output increasing again. So let's have a look at some factors now that affect the size of the budget deficit. It's important when considering a deficit to think in terms of government spending G and tax revenue T. So a recession that causes unemployment, this is going to cause a deficit because we're going to have an increase in G to pay benefits, and we're also going to have a reduction in tax revenue as people on average will have lower incomes and therefore pay less income tax. A decrease in consumer spending and profits leading to less tax revenue. If C goes down, we'll see a reduction in VAT receipts. And similarly, if there's less spending going on, firms will make less profits and we'll see less corporation tax as a result. And that might lead to perhaps a widening deficit as T goes down. An increase in activity, again, this is going to increase G. More money is spent on welfare benefits. Use of fiscal stimulus by a government to try and boost aggregate demand. So fiscal stimulus increases in G to try and boost AD. If we're trying to stimulate demand by increasing G, it makes no sense at that time to cut or to increase our tax revenue because that's just going to cut C and I. So we're going to keep T roughly the same in this case, but that's likely to lead to a deficit with constant tax revenue. The political landscape as well, this perhaps is a socio-political factor that will determine the size of budget deficit. But in general, Conservatives in the UK tend to spend less and tax more, and therefore they are going to lead to lower deficits in general. However, the Labour Party are perhaps more keen to spend a lot, but are more averse to taxing particularly on lower or working class people. Demographic factors may cause state pensions to rise. If our population gets older or even unhealthier, we're going to have to spend more G on either pensions, maybe the NHS if we have an unhealthier population. These things are going to have more spending depending on the makeup of our population. And there's these factors as well. They all affect the budget deficit, but clearly because the national debt is the sum total, the accumulation of deficits, so the sum of all deficits in the past, these factors are also going to affect the size of our national debt. But there are some other factors that will affect our national debt as well. The rate of interest to be paid on that debt. If, say, the rate of interest is very high, 10%, that means our national debt would grow at 10% each year, making it a lot bigger than if, say, the rate of interest on the national debt was 1%. It's only growing at 1% each year. It's slower growth to our national debt. The rate of economic growth as well, this can affect our ability of paying off our national debt. Remember what we were saying earlier, looking at our debt to GDP ratio. to GDP ratio, it's not necessarily problematic if our debt is going up but our GDP is increasing at a faster rate, because that means we have to give up less of our output for the year in order to pay off the same proportion of the debt. So imagine we have debt of 100 billion and a GDP, say, of 200 billion. Clearly, our debt to GDP ratio, 50% of our GDP is national debt, or the size of our national debt, rather, is 50% of our GDP. If our debt grew to 150 billion, that's an increase in our national debt. But if in the same time our GDP doubled to 400 billion, there our debt to GDP ratio is in fact smaller. It's now less than half. It's less than 50%. It's now only 37.5%, and that means that before we'd have to give up 6 months of output to pay our national debt. Now we'd only have to give up just over 4 months. So that's why it's important to see our debt to GDP ratio going down. We're not necessarily concerned if debt's going up a little bit. As long as our debt to GDP ratio is going down, it means you have to give up less of our output in order to pay back our national debt. Some pros and cons then of debt and deficit. So the pros, temporary deficits can protect economic welfare. This is saying in a recession, we want to see a bit of a deficit in order to pay those benefits, pay those welfare benefits, in order to protect people's welfare. And perhaps not good for the long run health of an economy if people are left to die in a recession. Rather, if we can take out a little deficit now in order to keep people's welfare up, that's going to improve our output in the future. If the deficit is used to fund infrastructure investment, i.e. supply side policies, for example, that increase our LRS, this deficit again isn't necessarily problematic because we'll have more growth in future and we'll be able to more easily pay off the debt and the deficit as a result of this infrastructure investment. Deficit can stimulate AD. A deficit for a short period of time can help an economy escape a liquidity trap where the savings ratio is very high despite a low interest rate. So if monetary policy is ineffective because we can't carry on cutting our interest rates, people might still want to save lots of money because they're making precautionary savings because they're not sure about the future health of the economy. Increases in G can be vital to getting AD to go up, because C and I are likely to be repressed because people are being very cautious. And that leads into point 4, where deficit can help kickstart growth in the economy. And once we're growing again, that allows us to pay back our debt more because it's shrinking debt as a percentage of our GDP. The key evaluation to these pros then is that a high deficit stimulated economy may act as a signal that future tax rates will rise. People might see, perhaps in a recession, they might see this increase in G without the increase in T. So they might see taxes low now to try and stimulate the economy, but they might expect an increase in taxes in the future. And in order to maintain a constant level of welfare into the future, they might try and save now so that they lose or have more money in the future when there's higher taxes. And this might lead some to start saving now, cutting consumption and investment. The cons then of debt and deficits is that the debt interest payments need paying back in the future. The greater our debt is, the more we need to pay back in interest. 10% of 100 billion is 10 billion pounds. However, if our national debt was 300 billion, the amount we'd have to pay back in interest every year would be 30 billion at 10%. So clearly there's a con to having a large debt, and that would have to pay more in debt interest. The need to borrow lots of money leads to higher yield rates, which may reduce private sector growth. Yield rates are the return on bonds, the return on people lending to the government, as it were. And if that's the case with higher yield rates, people are going to have more incentive to buy government bonds, i.e. save their money in a bond, rather than investing in the economy. So I might go down as a result of the high levels of debt and deficit. More borrowing may reduce a country's credit rating, more debt servicing costs as a result. If we have higher debt, increased debt, that's going to be seen as risky by investors. Perhaps they're going to think the UK isn't going to be necessarily very able to pay these back going forwards. And as a result, when we're loaning to the British government in the future, we might demand a higher interest rate from our lending. And that's obviously going to increase the debt servicing cost in the future, tying back to that first point. High deficits and debt will reduce investor confidence, less FDI into the UK. Yep, if the UK's got large debt, people might begin to fear for the health of the UK economy. They might not want to invest into the UK when they could invest into countries with less debt, which might appear more healthy. Deficits in a boom period are particularly unsustainable. This is a large structural deficit. In a boom, that should be really when we're trying to achieve budget surpluses so that we can pay back more readily our deficits that we're likely to see in a recession. There's an equity issue with the debt burden. In particular, this is generational. If we borrow lots today, is it really fair that our children will have to pay back this borrowing with their tax revenue without getting any of the benefits from government spending? So is taking massive debt out fair to future generations? There's also some inflation risks. If there's more debt, the government might, or the Bank of England rather, might try and increase the money supply in order to increase their ability to pay back the debt. But however, if there's still the same number of goods with more money in circulation, that's just going to push prices up, and that's going to lead to inflation. The key evaluation then, if the interest rate is low, the borrowing may not be that costly. Looking back to perhaps our point number one, what we had going on up here, if this interest rate was only 1%, which it is likely to be at the moment, very low, the 1% on the 100 billion debt would be only £1 billion, and on the 300 billion would be only £3 billion. In the grand scheme of things, for many large economies, that's not too much to pay in interest, and that level of debt and increasing of deficits may not necessarily be that problematic going forward. Final thing then, we need to look at perhaps some policies that can be employed to reduce fiscal deficits and national debt. So the first one, perhaps the deficits, fiscal austerity, and this was employed a lot by the Conservative Party under David Cameron. I say Conservatives, I also mean the coalition government, because the Lib Dems were supporting that Conservative government. So the fiscal austerity then is an increase in tax or cuts to government spending designed to try and reduce the government budget deficits. Ideally, these policies would reduce bureaucracy and exit efficiency, as it encourages cost cutting by firms because they're getting less because they would keep less of their profits under higher taxes, so they're going to try and cut costs in order to maintain profitability into the future. The aim of this fiscal austerity is to remove any structural budget deficits. However, perhaps a key evaluation to fiscal austerity is that the deficit, when austerity was employed, we were in a very slow recovery in our economic cycle, and perhaps that was the time to have a budget deficit to stimulate growth rather than using fiscal austerity, which would, if anything, stifle growth. We could undertake supply side reform. Increasing level of growth creates a fiscal dividend. By having more output, firms will have more profits, workers will have higher incomes, and because of that, even with the same tax rate, we'll get greater tax revenue. And furthermore, because our GDP is growing and our debt isn't growing very much, we can pay back our debt more readily. Automatic stabilizers as well in a recovery, in a boom. Our growth, our economic growth there leads to higher levels of tax revenue and lower levels of G, thus cutting the size of any fiscal deficit. Policies then to reduce national debt. We can try and turn our fiscal deficit into a surplus. See the policies above to reduce fiscal deficit, because with our national debt is essentially the sum of all our yearly deficits. If we have surpluses, that's going to be a negative deficit, as it were. That's going to push our national debt down. We could allow inflation to erode the real value of debt. What that's saying is, if our debt stays at roughly £1 billion and a basket of goods costs £1,000, say there's inflation and a basket of goods now costs £2,000. Before, our national debt was large enough to buy 1 million baskets of goods, but now with inflation, our national debt is only really worth 500,000 baskets of goods. So the debt has been eroded by inflation. The real value of that debt has been eroded by inflation. And the final policy to reduce national debt is a national default on the debt. And this is where a government stops paying back bond owners and writes off any remaining debt it owes. And this is a last resort policy. And you will study this at the start of next year when we look at some of our roles of central banks in greater detail. But the reason this is a last resort is if the government just decides not to pay back any people who have lent to it in the past. In future, should the government need to borrow again, no one is going to lend to the government going forward because it's seen as too risky. Because they've already defaulted once, what's to stop them defaulting again? That's quite a risky place to save your money, quite a risky person to loan your money to. And then, as we looked at before, if we increase our growth and lower our debt to GDP ratio, that's going to help us reduce our national debt because we have to give up less output in order to pay it back, as we saw in that numerical example earlier on in the presentation. Cool, so that then brings us on to looking at our tasks for the week. So our first task, which you should have all done, is make notes using this video. The question pack, or the pack, as you've seen, it has some prompts in it, question prompts. Try and make sure that you answer these in your notes. Again, try and upload your notes to your class notebook on OneNote, either typed or as a PDF printout, or scans pictures of your handwritten notes. You can use the collaboration space in the class notebook to try and discuss the content and ask questions to your teacher and your peers. Once you've done the notes, the next task is the MCQs. The link's there, but it's also in the pack. Complete those quickly, please. There's then a worksheet to have a go at. Again, put your answers in the class notebook on OneNote. There's an essay planning task. Please only type your plans if you would use a laptop in your exams. Otherwise, use a pen and upload your completed plans to your class notebook. There's also some extension reading this week. Feel free, that's optional, feel free to have a go at that, make some notes. The key objective is stated at the start of the reading, and we can discuss this once you return to school. That reading is quite interesting. It's by Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he talks about the role or the implications of public sector debt. During our class hours, check your teams for any individual class instructions. I'm probably going to try and use a collaboration space again with my classes during lesson hours, but just check, as I said, in case anything changes. And when it comes to uploading your work, please try and upload onto the team's assignment, and on a new tab in your class notebook homework page on OneNote, also upload the PDF as a printout so we can easily mark it. The deadline for this is the 18th of May at 9 a.m, so that's next Monday morning. If you need an extension, obviously, please speak to us to save us having to chase you up. It's really important. Obviously, quite uncertain times at the moment. Please let us know so we don't spend loads of time trying to chase you up. Okay then, chaps. Good luck with all this. Any questions, just ask. Keep